Welcome to Seattle Atheist Church. Atheists, agnostics, skeptics, free thinkers, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. Our church was founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We attempt to be excellent to all conscious beings, and we believe in good, because good works in non-mysterious ways. If that sounds good to you, then you are probably in the right place. One thing I'd like to do is I would like to invite everyone on the third Saturday of the month at 3 o'clock at Brower's Brewery in Fremont. We have a secular social, and everyone is invited to that. And what we'll do is we'll get into a circle, and we're going to have our talk, and then we'll get into our circle and we'll discuss. We'll finish up at about 1:30 so that we can have another 15 minutes of just kind of milling around and talking. We have to be out by 1:55. Is the planning meeting next week? It might be. Check the website, because everyone is invited to our planning meeting. If you like coming to church and you want to support it financially, there should be a jar at the back of the room, or you can go to seattleatheist.church and make a donation there. Donations go to rent the room, and also we have a goal of getting ourselves into some street fairs and stuff. Okay, just want to make sure. Thanks very much. Wait, yes.
Also, the previous lectures are on the website, so if you want wonderful, interesting lectures.
Okay, thanks. Looking forward to this one.
Okay. What would you say if your best friend came up to you tomorrow and told you that they were thinking of killing themselves? You'd obviously try and dissuade them, but what meaning would you offer them? What purpose would you encourage them to pursue? The prominent 20th century philosopher and existentialist Albert Camus called this the central philosophical problem. And existentialists in general tended to focus on these problems of existence. Sort of, what does it all mean? Now, existentialism encompasses a sort of disparate and broad range of thinkers and ideas, but they're all sort of united by this mantra that was coined by the first person to call himself an existentialist, the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. And he said, existence precedes essence. Essence being sort of like a purpose that defines who we are. This was a response largely to an idea from way back in ancient Greece, ascribed to by the archetypal philosophers Plato and Aristotle. And they believed in essentialism, essentially the idea that everything and everyone has a purpose built into them before they even come into existence. Now, with objects, it's pretty easy to see how essence precedes existence. The chairs that you're all sitting on, for example, were pretty obviously made for the purpose of you sitting on them. And they believed that with human beings, the human essence was rational thought. The existentialists disagree with all of that. They say we're born without meaning. And this sounds sort of atheistic, but existentialism is not synonymous with atheism. In fact, 2 of the 3 philosophers who are credited with founding existentialism were themselves Christians. That's the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard and the 19th century Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky. The 3rd philosopher credited with being one of the fathers of existentialism was the very atheistic German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, the common theological view is that God made man with a purpose in mind. So the existentialist Christians just disagree with that sort of part. They might say, like, we're so disconnected from God's will, or we can't interpret God's purpose that he made for us, or they might even say that God made man without any purpose at all. Existentialism is also often charged with sort of emphasizing the dark side of life, and often conflated with nihilism as well. Nihilism being the idea that life is just meaningless. And existentialists agree with nihilists in the sense that they believe that there is no objective meaning to life. But the difference is existentialists believe that that lack of objective meaning opens the door for us to create our own subjective meaning. So in a way, our only essence as human beings is the ability to define our own essence. Now, the tensions that arise here are sort of what existentialists call the absurd. It's kind of the inevitable clash between our desperate need for meaning as human beings and the just meaninglessness of the world. And existentialism became like really popular in World War II times. They were like, well, if Nazis can just go around killing millions of innocent people, then maybe there's not like a divine arbiter of justice. So they were super aware that in the real world, there's no absolutes, no justice, no fairness, no rules. Bad things happen to good people. But in some sense, in an objective sense, there is no bad or good person or situation. And the author Dostoevsky brought this up first in his book, The Brothers Karamazov, where he's speaking through one of his main characters and says, nowhere is it written that good exists. He says, if God is dead, then everything is permitted. Then a few years later, Nietzsche came around and was like, well, funny you mentioned that, because God is dead. So yeah, everything is permitted. And he wasn't like happy about this. He wasn't exclaiming, God is dead, hurrah for atheism. Actually, it was quite the opposite. Nietzsche was saying, holy shit, God is dead. What are we going to do now? How are we going to fill this huge void that's left in the absence of like the biggest part of human existence in history? Because once we admit that God is dead, all possibility of finding our values and this sort of like heaven of ideas disappears too. Sartre calls this forlornness. That's the sort of like title he gives for like facing the consequences of the fact that there is no God. And existentialists in general oppose any sort of like secular ethics that want to just like abolish God without any effort. He has a great anecdote about a student who came to him seeking advice. A student of his was trying to decide between fighting for a cause that he believed in the war that was going on at the time, and staying with his lonely mother who had already lost her other children to the war. The point is, there's no book of ethics that the student could just turn to and read to get the answer. You can't just like go read Kant or read the Bible and figure out what's the right path. Because once we've discarded God, then someone else has to invent morality, and that has to be us. That's why Sartre says we're condemned to be free. We have this overwhelming abundance of freedom. And as soon as we become aware of that freedom and aware of the fact that we alone are the incontestable authors of our lives, we can't help but feel this excruciating responsibility. This doctrine horrifies people who want to say that the circumstances were against me, because it forces them to realize that they and they alone are responsible for everything that happens to them. That's why Sartre says we're alone in the world with no excuses. We can't blame our passions or our heredity or the environment that we grew up in for the things that happen to us. Even choosing not to leave a situation, to Sartre, is a choice. So if you're drafted into the military and your country's fighting a war that you don't support, you have to find a way to get out of that situation, be it desertion or even suicide. Because if you don't, then you're complicit in whatever it is that your country is doing. Now, Sartre also believes that this responsibility deepens even further when you realize that you're not only making choices for yourself, but for all of mankind. He says every choice that you make is at the same time affirming the values of whatever it is that you're chosen, whatever it is that you've chosen. And if you're affirming the value of the things that you've chosen, then you're simultaneously willing that other people do the same. Now, one might contend here, well, I didn't ask to be born. I don't think I have the ability to exercise my existential freedom to change my time or place of birth, or my race, or my past, or any of these things. And Sartre would agree these things he calls facticities, sort of the concrete details against the background of which our freedom is limited. And he says that by ascribing a value to our facticities, we're expressing our freedom. So we're still free to decide what we think of our facticity. So when we assume a attitude towards our facticity and we reflect upon our facticity, in a sense we are choosing whatever it is. And Camus talks about this in his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. He tells the story of Sisyphus, who is condemned by the gods to push this giant rock up a hill. And as soon as he gets to the top of the hill, right when he's just about to make it, the rock falls back down all the way to the bottom, and he has to go back down and push it again for all eternity. Now, the gods thought that this was the most cruel punishment they could possibly give someone, to have to do this futile and hopeless labor forever. Sisyphus is able to exercise his existential freedom through his attitude towards his situation, however. So, in the end, he ends up finding meaning in pushing this rock, despite knowing that the rock is just going to come back down. There's no real objective purpose. So, Albert Camus invites us to imagine Sisyphus happy. Another contention that people have with existentialism is they say existentialists can't pass judgment. They say, well, if there's no right or wrong, then one can choose anything. And Sartre would say, yeah, one can choose anything as long as it's on the grounds of free involvement. He says freedom can have no other aim but to want itself, which is kind of a bit of an axiomatic assumption, but he goes on to say the person who realizes their freedom can't help but want freedom as the basis for all values. And on this grounds, he can judge people who try and hide from their freedom or hide from the arbitrariness of their existence. Sartre calls this bad faith, sort of the idea of trying to shirk your existential responsibilities and follow the path that others have set for you, be it your parents or your government or your religion. And existentialists in general vehemently reject any all-encompassing systems about meaning and purpose like this. They see that systems like this can be attractive because they remove the burden of us having to create our own meaning, but they also recognize that these authorities are just people like you and me, and they don't really have any answers. So Albert Camus says that his only goal is to live without appeal, and that means without appealing to any other authority or external factors when deciding how he wants to live. And this is also called living authentically, sort of the idea that you want to create yourself based on your true self and accept the weight of your freedom despite the absurd. Nietzsche has a good illustration of sort of how seriously we are supposed to take this project of figuring out how to live through what he calls the eternal recurrence. So he invites you to imagine the last 5 minutes of your life. And imagine that someone came up to you and said, you have to relive the last 5 minutes of your life over and over and over again for all of eternity. And if you're doing existential freedom right, you should be able to say, yeah, I'm okay with that. Like, I'm down to keep living those last 5 minutes, like, that works for me. And that's sort of like his litmus test for trying to figure out if you are living well enough or thinking hard enough about how you're living your life. Now, Kierkegaard writes about how he enjoyed contemplating what he calls the great people who found that precious stone for which they are willing to sell all, even their lives, proceeding on their chosen course without vacillating. So here we find ourselves on this moist speck of dust, rotating around a medium star in an average galaxy, one of billions. And it seems very unlikely that 200 trillion stars were created just for us. So if our life is all we get to experience, then it's all that matters, really. If the universe has no principles, then the only relevant ones are the ones that we decide on. And if the universe has no purpose, then we get to choose it. We get to experience food, sunsets, and being with each other, and music. We have this overwhelming abundance of freedom in a universe-sized playground. And in this area, we get to explore ourselves and the world around us. We have countless cities to visit, people to help, mountains to climb, and video games to play. If this is our one shot at life, then there's no reason not to be as happy as possible. Kierkegaard writes, "What matters is to find a purpose, to find a truth that is true for me, to find the idea for which I'm willing to live and die." So, the existentialists invite us to do what makes you feel good, and you get to decide what that means for you.